It's February the 2nd, 2023. Hello and welcome to Success Tips Global. This is Educator speaking with a Japan-based American educator, Mr. Frank Pridgen. Welcome to Success Tips Global.
Thank you very much.
So my first question is, how long have you been in Japan?
Okay, I'm almost up to 25 years of living in Japan.
Wow.
Which now is over half of my life.
Incredible. And what first brought you to Japan, and from which part of the US did you come?
So the second question first, I'm originally from Georgia in America, in the northwest corner of Georgia, in a small mountain village. And it's about as far from Japan as many people could imagine.
Right.
But when I was young at family reunions, I heard lots of stories about Japan, as my father and his siblings had lived in Japan on a military base in the late 60s, early 70s. So in our house and in other relatives' houses, we had lots of items from Japan. So there were hanging scrolls and proper Japanese style futons, cushions, oil paintings of Mount Fuji, Japanese umbrellas and dolls, things that you didn't find in anybody else's houses.
I see.
So hearing those stories sparked my initial interest in Japan. And that in turn led to starting to study Japanese when I was a high school student.
Okay.
And that in turn led to my first study abroad in Japan.
Okay, so talk a little bit about the study abroad program.
The first time I came was through the Japanese class that I was attending. My own high school didn't offer Japanese as an elective at that time.
Okay.
But one of the other high schools in town started a after-school Japanese program and invited students from the other high schools in the city. This was in Chattanooga, Tennessee.
Okay.
And with that, developed a exchange program with schools in Tono City, Iwate. And that was my first study abroad experience. It was 1 month in the summer of 92.
Long time ago.
A long time ago, a very different Japan than the Japan now.
And what kinds of activities did you do while you were on that program?
Okay, so the first 3 weeks of the program, it was about 1 month long, but the first 3 weeks we spent primarily in Tono City and in Iwate, with each of us staying at a different host family. I think there were maybe 10 people in our group, along with 2 teachers. But each one of us stayed with a different host family. And then during the day, we would all go and meet at the local high school. And we would either attend some classes with the other students. It was right before summer vacation started for Japan. Or we would go and tour famous things in the area. So we went to see the large Kannon statue at Kamaishi City. We went and had chances to eat things like wanko soba. And of course, being high schoolers, all challenged each other to eat the most cups. And more or less just got to experience going to Japanese shopping malls and other things. Then the final week to 10 days was a whirlwind tour of famous things between Iwate, then heading down to Tokyo, and then we went all the way west as far as Hiroshima.
Wow.
So along the way, one of the teachers in the group had lived in Japan before. So we were taken to many of the favorite restaurants and introduced to different styles of food, everything from the Hiroshima style okonomiyaki to I mentioned the wanko soba earlier, and other just favorites of this teacher along the way. But we visited, I think the highlights probably were Himeji Castle.
Okay.
Then we went to Miyajima. So the proper name, Itsukushima.
Okay.
Then along with that, we, what was the other famous place? Went to, of course, Tokyo Disneyland as part of it. And then a few things that I don't believe you're able to see anymore. We went and were able to watch the Tokyo Metropolitan Police Department's traffic management headquarters.
Okay.
Where they showed us basically that they can control every individual traffic light in the city from the headquarters, which to 15-year-old me was very impressive, because my own hometown had exactly 2 traffic lights and they were flashing. So, but at that point, Japan was very different than now. I remember my first impression was simply everybody is Japanese, which would make sense. If you're in America, people are American. If you're in Japan, people would be Japanese. But it was more the ways that we were accustomed to differentiating people,
Right.
body type, tall people, short people, wide people, thin people, then all different colors of hair and hairstyles, blonde, red, brown, black, curly, straight, long, short, blue eyes, green eyes, brown eyes, and then of course all of the different clothing styles. But that first day in Tokyo, we saw lots of Japanese businessmen, all wearing basically the same uniform. And then the Japanese school children that were going to school. And it was a very surreal experience, because all of the things that we were accustomed to say, who is who, were suddenly taken away from us. So you had to be much more aware of people's actual like facial construction. And that was one of the big surprises. And then everything just seemed very fast paced, which I think hasn't really changed.
Right. Okay, so you mentioned high school. So then after high school, what did you do?
Okay. Actually, right before I graduated high school, I left America, and I left my high school 2 months before my own graduation to go on a 1-year study abroad to a different place in Japan. So the 1-year study abroad was in Nagano Prefecture. And I studied at a high school named Shinonoi High School. And that was another stepping out of the nest. So while my American classmates were wrapping up their high school careers, I extended mine by an additional 10 months and attended a Japanese high school. And that was when I really decided that I enjoyed Japan and I wanted to learn more about the language, the country, and everything. Pretty much everything that has really led me to where I am today.
Okay. So you went back and graduated.
That's correct.
Okay, and then after that, what happened?
Okay, so after finishing studies at university, I went to the University of Georgia,
Okay.
and as you may have guessed, I majored in Japanese language and literature, and pretty much just had a wonderful time at university. Then, before I ended up coming to Japan, I worked for 1 year as a Japanese teacher at the Baylor School in Chattanooga, Tennessee,
Okay.
which was my alma mater as well. And after that was when I was like, okay, it is time to go to Japan because I was not comfortable enough with my own Japanese. It was enough to teach Japanese. It was enough to get by with normal conversations, but it wasn't at the ability that I would be comfortable saying, yes, I can speak Japanese.
Right.
And I came to Japan with the intent of being here for 3 years on the JET program. I'm sure that you know of the JET program.
Yes, I do.
But it was under the auspices of the Japanese government and brought in theory, young adults to Japan to spend up to 3 years teaching, studying, and living, working in Japan.
Okay.
And then have them go back to their own countries and bring in more as parts of both improving the English language skills of Japanese school children with the ultimate goal of Japanese people at having a much higher level than they did at that point, but also grassroots internationalization.
Right.
And by having foreigners living in all of these small school districts around the country, remove some of the mysticism, I might even say, that was around foreign people in the early 90s, mid 90s. Okay, I want to say that the JET program itself started in the early 90s. It was an offshoot of the Monbusho English Fellows.
Okay.
But that was how I came over. And I spent 3 years on the program at the tip of the Noto Peninsula, which is in Ishikawa Prefecture.
And where is Ishikawa?
Ishikawa is located on the inside crook of Honshu. So if you have the Sea of Japan that's kind of cradled by Honshu, and in the middle of that is a peninsula that sticks up, and the bulk of that is Ishikawa Prefecture. And I lived in a small city of about, I believe the population at that point was around 20,000 people.
Okay.
Which was about half of my college town that I had moved from. But I taught there at a junior high school and high school for 3 years. And I loved that place so much that to this date, I call it my second hometown.
Wow. What were some of your experiences there?
There were so many, but I think highlights would be one, the first impression in the city. I happened to arrive on the day of the Ida Festival, which is one of the many, many, many local festivals. But the previous English teacher was kind of escorting me and introducing me to different people. But the first kind of shocking thing was she's like, oh, I see some of your students. I'm going to introduce you. And pulls me over to a group of the high school students. And all the boys are wearing, which to my understanding at that point, would have just been very, very red and pink kimonos with lots of bells tied to them that, looked very girly for, and was very surprised because these were very, I don't want to say tough guy looking, but the more macho of the students. And later learned that no, that is just the traditional attire for that particular festival. They're called a dodera, but that word might mean nothing outside of that own local community.
Right.
But that was just kind of a jet-lagged, tired me arriving and being introduced to all of the students that I would need to try to remember in just a surreal situation. Then that immediately, though, tied into what later became one of my pursuits, which was learning lots about Japanese festivals.
Okay.
And that was a great place to learn about festivals. In the month of September alone, they had over 35 unique festivals happening in that month, which meant that somewhere in the town, every night for the entire month of September, you could find a festival to attend.
Wow.
And some of them had everything from special floats that are called kiriko, that I believe are mostly unique to Ishikawa. Then they had other ones from one particular town where all of the boys growing up have personalized kesho mawashi made. Kesho mawashi are the large garments that you see the sumo wrestlers wear when they're filing in at the beginning of the matches with the long things that are intricately embroidered.
Okay.
And I asked how much it actually cost to make those. And most of them, the cheapest ones I heard, I believe, were in the neighborhood of $3,000 to $4,000 US.
Wow.
And yet, for every family with a male child, they would have one made for the child. And they looked incredible. One of the other festivals had the people who came of age that year would put on a particular play performance that they would do every year. But the only people that could partake and perform would be the people who became a returning 20 either that year or the year before. And that was in Takojima. But there were so many festivals, and I love the atmosphere, the history, but also some of these festivals had a history longer than the United States as a country. And I believe some of them may have had a history longer than European settlers in the lands that would become the United States of America. And that for me was always a interesting feel. And to this date is knowing that sometimes I can find a place in Japan where this building was here 100 years before the Declaration of Independence was written. And it really helps put things in perspective.
Okay, you had a foundation in learning Japanese while you were in the States.
Yes.
Once you came the second time, or was it the third time? The third time.
Yeah.
Did you let the learning of the language evolve naturally, or did you study it seriously?
I mostly let lots of it go naturally.
Okay.
But it was always punctuated with times of focused sit down study.
Okay.
One of the big things that I've been lucky with
Mhm.
is vocabulary has usually been something that I can acquire
Mhm.
without too much difficulty.
Okay.
But I think it's that anytime that I'm learning new words, I'm trying to always connect them with other things that I've previously learned.
Okay.
And with Japanese for the kanji,
Mm.
that was for me, luckily, easy because as I learned more compounds that
Mhm.
went with individual characters, um, it was like multiplication. It was exponential that, oh,
Mm.
I can use this character in this combination for this word, which then made it more evident for the next word that I
Mm.
learned that also used that
Mm. Mm.
for tie-ins. And that was one that appealed to me. But lots I learned by, I would say when I was here on my 1 year long study abroad,
Mm.
was I was in a class of 42 high school students. I
Mm.
myself was also a high school student.
Right.
And at that point, I could either try to just talk with everybody in English and force all of them to try to use English to communicate with me,
Mm.
or I could try to speak Japanese.
Mm. Mm.
And as a result, I spoke lots of Japanese,
Mm. Mm.
and I had no shame in making mistakes in Japanese,
Right.
which I know at one other point where we had discussed things, I'm
Mm.
sure I've mentioned this, but making mistakes is a
Mm.
great way to learn anything, but
Mm.
especially language,
Right.
because each time I put my foot in my mouth or said something completely unintended,
Mm.
it was fairly evident by the other person's facial expression that I had messed up. So I would either ask them what they think I said
Mhm.
so that I could correct them, or just say, I think I've said something wrong, and then
Mm.
try to explain.
Mm.
Um, and that was something that was perhaps the most important lesson I had learned from my first Japanese teacher.
Mm. Mm.
And she told a story where when she was an exchange student in Japan,
Mm.
and this would have been in the 1980s, where
Mm.
foreigners were even more rare, that she had stayed with her host family, but they did not have a bath at their house. So the
Okay.
whole family would go to the local public bath.
Mm.
And she had been there for about a week with no incident. But one day she went down to the bath and said that there were these two Japanese grandmothers that were in the bath. And when she came in, just said their eyes went wide, and they kept just basically staring at her and turning and talking to each other and just ignoring her, but then staring at her and talking more.
Mhm.
And she got fed up. And so she tried to think of what she could say, and she made a decision, went
Mm.
up to them and said, I am a human, with the intent being to say, I'm a person
Mhm.
like you. Please
Mm.
don't stare.
Mm.
Things that were beyond her vocabulary at that
Right.
point. But she said that their eyes got even wider and that they like laughed and just stared at her more. So she got frustrated, left, went back, and wanted to make sure that, you know, she had said what she thought she said,
Right.
and goes through the dictionary looking it up, and was looking it up from the Japanese,
Mhm.
and realized that instead of saying the word for human, ningen,
Okay.
she had said the word for carrot, ninjin. So she had stood in front of the two Japanese women and said, I am a carrot.
That's a good one.
But she said that she never made a mistake after that with the words human or carrot.
Right.
And likewise, myself and everybody in that particular Japanese class, we made lots of our own mistakes, but none of us ever made a mistake between the words human and carrot. And I think that willingness to make mistakes is the key to pretty much any pursuit where learning is involved, but especially language learning.
Right. Okay, so go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say, so that when I was letting my Japanese improve naturally, it was lots of trying to say things, and then when there were mistakes made,
Right.
using that to kind of design my own learning and naturally go that way. But at other times, I would sit and do focus study either through practice for the JLPT, the Japanese Language Proficiency Test, or going through and getting a book on colloquialisms or a book focused on a different aspect of the Japanese language.
Did you take a class to prepare for the language test?
I did not take an official class. The school that I was at the time did have a Japanese instructor who would coach and help guide things, but the vast majority of it was self-taught and asking the particular teacher for details if I was unclear on usage.
Right.
But one of the most common answers, and this was frustrating, was when showing a test question and just saying, which of these answers is it? And that native Japanese instructor looking at it and just saying, okay, of these 4 choices, it would have to be this, but we would never actually say it that way. We would say it this 5th way that was not one of the 4 choices. And that was one of the big things that in my own English instruction in my classes, I try to make very clear why we wouldn't say these particular other ways, but at least how to deduce what the anticipated correct answer would be. But language is a strange and interesting thing.
Right. So you've taught beyond high school students. What are some of the challenges of teaching in Japan in general?
I think the biggest challenge with teaching in Japan is culturally related to 2 main points. One being related to what we were just talking about, a unwillingness to make mistakes. It's that little bit of shame in making a mistake that it's better to say I don't know than to attempt an answer and be wrong.
Right.
And in America, I think the base idea is generally it's better to, take a swing, try to hit a home run and miss than it is to just not attempt anything at all. So there's that bit about, not trying to make mistakes, so not trying to say correct things either. And then the other one is the major difference in listening to English versus listening to Japanese. And due to those differences, when Japanese people are learning in schools, they tend to not learn linking and how all of the sounds between words in English link together, and instead use discrete word by word. I've heard some people jokingly refer to it as speaking like Captain Kirk.
Okay.
So, what are you doing? Instead of the, what are you doing?
Right, right.
Which, if we wrote it like it sounded, it would be a, what are you doing?
Right, right, right.
And Japanese is a syllable timed language.
Mm-hmm.
Every particular sound is on an even beat, and each person speaks at different speeds, but the language itself, if you set a metronome to that person's speaking, it would be perfectly timed. And that's due to the nature of the Japanese language, where the difference between a one syllable vowel and a two syllable extended vowel make drastic changes from word to word. So shoujo with short O's is girl. Shoujo with long O's is a orangutan.
Big difference.
So you have to be careful.
Right.
Somebody may want to introduce an orangutan to you or not. Then the same token, there is the a character that's a small Su Japanese character, but it indicates that you will have one beat with no sound, and then the sound after that is a little bit stronger than usual.
Okay.
But that also changes the meanings of words. And if you don't have everything at a particular rhythm, then there's no way to listen to the language and actually understand what words are being said. English, on the other hand, is a stress-timed language. We have a slower beat, but in general, during one person's conversation or speaking, all of the important data-bearing, meaning-bearing words tend to be on the main beat. Helping verbs, let's see, articles, a and the, prepositions all tend to not be on the beat. But if you can listen to the beat, then you can actually hear where the native English speakers important words are. And that way you don't have to decode every word that's being said.
Right.
Unfortunately, for the Japanese listener, that means that we speed up and slow down our speaking in the middle of a sentence in order to make the words land on these beats.
Okay.
And it's not something that we're taught in the American schools. It's just naturally based on how everybody speaks. And when that's combined with the linking of sounds to where we aren't saying each word individually, it makes English extremely difficult for Japanese learners of English to hear and decode, especially if all of their instruction has been word, word, word based reading and practice.
Right.
And that's been one of the hardest things in my own classes as well, to help students get over. And ultimately, it's lots of practice and metacognition about these differences and helping work with them so that they can hear English as English, as opposed to words for translation in the English to Japanese, Japanese to English algorithm.
Right. What do you enjoy yourself about teaching?
I just love watching the success of all of my students. And each small victory that is something that I know they couldn't do before, but now they do, or when I hear a student start self-correcting with a problem that I know they had been struggling with, but they went from perhaps making a mistake often
Mm.
and not realizing it was a mistake to slowly going, wait, not this, correcting themselves, and then
Right.
ultimately getting over it and being able to use the English naturally.
Mm.
And that bit of growth is something that I enjoy seeing no matter the age of the students.
Mm.
I've taught as young as 3-year-old students
Mm.
all the way through senior citizens.
Right.
And each of the small victories
Mm.
is one of the ones that reminds me that this is why I enjoy what
Mm.
I do.
Mm.
And also being able to share with students cultural background
Right.
between language and words. That's something that, even though machine translation is getting better and better
Mm.
every day, the being able to just read something that's been translated into your language and read something that you understand the background
Mm.
behind all of these words and the significance of that language choice are completely different levels of understanding.
Mm. 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 You've been a manager
Yes,
in an educational institution here. Talk a little bit about that. What was good about it? What was difficult about it?
right. Um, to start off, I'll say that I enjoyed my time working as a manager,
Mm.
but once I stopped being a manager and set out on my own, one of the first things I decided that was just a flat out decision was that I would never want to work in management again unless the salary was absurdly high.
Mm.
And that was just, it's a lot of work.
Mm.
And I think that it's probably true of management in not just education, but in most places.
Mm. Mm.
But my day-to-day life as management or in management at the English school, it was one
Mm.
of the um, English language schools in Japan.
Mm.
And it was one of the largest ones in the area, had a sizable foreign teaching staff.
Mm.
I think the largest we had while I was there was maybe 13 or even 14 teachers.
Mm.
And um, with that comes lots of work
Right.
because one was being in Japan, offering the necessary support for all of the staff.
Mm.
Um, I've long been a believer that if you take care of other people and
Mm.
do right by them,
Mm.
most of them will do right by you. And I had seen some places and heard of places where teachers would come in and it was, okay, welcome to Japan. Here's your apartment. Your rent is due to this bank account by this day, and come to work tomorrow. And beyond that,
Mm. Mm.
it was sink or swim.
Right.
It was like, if you wanted to find a particular, let's say, ingredient
Right.
for cuisine that you needed, well, you had to find somebody to help you because a school wouldn't.
Right.
And that was one of the things that, at the point that I had become a manager, I had already lived in Japan for 5 years.
Mm.
And I decided that no, we're going to make sure that people have what they need.
Right.
Um, if you come to Japan and you say, hey, I really want to do karate or
Mm.
I want to learn Japanese cooking,
Mm.
that was what I would try to help find a place to do.
Mm.
Um, but the most troubling ones were often all the visits to banks and city hall
Okay.
to get people ready and set up. And it's much better now, but that was when often things were required to be submitted in triplicate.
Okay.
And many places like the banks would require that the forms be filled out by those individuals, even if they couldn't speak Japanese, which would be ultimately like just trying to copy somebody else's handwriting.
Right.
And it was a lot of work. Then also the occasional problems with traffic accidents or the like often were things that would take a lot of time. But outside of that part of management, which is by no means a standard one,
Right.
I think the other thing was dealing with cultural differences in work ethics and work expectations from different countries.
Okay.
And in this case, it wasn't only America and Japan, but it included all of the other countries that our teachers came from. Primarily, teachers were from America, Canada, the United Kingdom, New Zealand, Australia, lots of the Commonwealth countries were main ones, but also we had teachers from Singapore, Hong Kong, and all of us, of course, spoke with different accents.
Right.
I think the American teachers alone had 3 different accents. And with that, different ideas with work and how you spend your time. Some would be like, these are my work hours.
Right.
100%, that's it. And then once I'm done with that, I'm gone. Other people would be more flexible and say, look, I'll help out when I can, but I want to have these days off, in return. And some people would be the other way, just like, oh no, I'll do anything. I enjoy this. Of course, there was extra pay for that, but they didn't expect anything beyond that. But in America, often, if you have a meeting time, that means if you come in the door 2 seconds before that meeting starts, you're good. The opposite was true, of course, for Japan. If you come in 2 minutes before the meeting, you might be considered late. And those ideas with time, deadlines, and things were always very, very different. And then along with that, the different expectations of students in Japan versus students elsewhere. One of the ones that I stress with many teachers that start teaching privately in Japan is the importance of watching time. That at the English school, if a student was scheduled for a 30-minute class, you were expected to give them 30 minutes, no more, no less.
Okay.
And on one way, you could view it saying, oh, the school's cheap. If you aren't paying us, we aren't going to do anything.
Right.
But, and that was my first instinct as well. But later, I was told and then thought about and realized that, yes, in Japan, this would be the case. Many of the students have other things that they are doing besides English. So they may be in the school for, let's say, the 6 to 6:30 in the afternoon block. But at 6:45 is when they have to pick their child up from swimming lessons, a 10-minute drive away. So if we go over by 1 minute, then we could actually throw their whole punctual schedule into disarray. And later, when I was taking multiple classes and doing other things myself, I realized, yes, I would plan my own schedules where I know if I finish here and I leave at this time of day, I have just enough time to make it here at this time. And what as a teacher I thought was being kind and giving an extra 5 minutes just to complete the discussion we were in,
right.
instead of saying, oh, that's all the time we have, get out the door,
right.
was more like, oh, okay, I'm sorry, we are out of time for today, and allowing them to leave. And that was one that culturally, I still always feel the need for my own culture and upbringing to give that extra time and allow that extra time. But I tend to err on the side of caution unless I know the students very well and say, hey, do you have 5 extra minutes today so that we can finish this? And teaching privately on my own, I can ask that. But when I was in a school, it was best to not do it. And of course, my role of manager was also to protect the school as well. So there was lots of that side of being in a managerial position where my job is first and foremost to manage and protect the school. Secondly, manage and protect all the teachers. And sometimes protecting the teachers from the school, and sometimes protecting the school from the teachers. And yes, that was often one of those mixed bags where I'm being pulled in 2 different ways. So it's, explaining, nope, from the American way of thinking, XYZ, but to the Japanese side, and then turn to the Japanese side. Well, this, and now from the Japanese side of thinking, it ABC this way, and hopefully finding a happy medium between the two, where even if an agreement can't necessarily be made, at least there's some more understanding as to why that agreement couldn't be reached. And I would say that that was the hardest part of management.
Wow. What kind of cultural activities have you been involved in?
Oh, too many. I mentioned earlier, I love Japanese culture. I've long been fascinated with it, but the main cultural related ones would be martial arts of different types. I've done the first one, Japanese one I did was kendo, which is Japanese fencing using bamboo swords. And then when I was in university, I started doing one called Jodo. And Jodo means way of the staff. And it's using a staff that's about maybe 120 centimeters long and maybe 2 to 3 centimeters in diameter. And it's always interesting because it sounds a lot like the word judo, the martial art where you throw people. And I learned this first at university in America. But after I finished my time in Ishikawa, I did kendo for the 3 years I was in Ishikawa as well. But when I moved to Aomori, in my first week there, I was working at City Hall, and one of the people introduced themselves and said that, I went to watch one of the kendo practices, and one of the people there came up and introduced himself and was, I think he was like 78 years old at that point, but introduced himself and said that, he does kendo, iaido, and jodo. And here I am shocked because in the 3 years I was in Ishikawa, I didn't find anybody who had heard of the sport before. So when I said, oh, Jodo, I do Jodo too. And he's like, no, not judo, Jodo. And I'm like, yeah, with the staff. And then it was his turn to be shocked and surprised. And that's how I chose my dojo to go to in the 4 years I was there, and started doing lots of Jodo in addition to Kendo. and a small bit of Iaido.
What is that?
Iaido is whereas Kendo is using bamboo swords to actually hit each other, Iaido is using actual swords. Many are made without a cutting edge due to Japanese laws.
Okay.
But to do kata for simulated fighting against imagined opponents. And it's one of the ones that you'll often see in the movies before the people are actually fighting, in order to show you that, oh, this person can use a sword. We'll show them going through those moves as parts of training. Then after moving from Aomori to Ibaraki, where I currently am, I stopped doing all martial arts for a while. And that was unfortunately simply due to work. The prime hours for English conversation schools start in the early afternoon and go through 9 or 10 at night.
Right.
And most adults that work the normal business hours are free starting around 5 or 6 in the afternoon, which means most martial arts dojos and lessons are during the main hours that people are taking English lessons as well as these other ones. So for a long time, I didn't do any. But let's see, maybe 8 or 9 months ago, I started doing naginata. And
What
it
is naginata?
Feels great to be back in the dojo. But naginata is the Japanese halberd. So instead of the 120 centimeter thing, now maybe have a 160, 170 centimeter long staff that has a blade at the end of it. Of course, we also are using ones that have a bamboo blade at the end of it. But historically, naginata was mostly a woman's weapon. And it was traditionally viewed as one for the women of the household in the samurai households to use to protect the household from intruders or enemies, while the male warriors were away at war. And to this day, there is still a much, much, much larger number of female naginata practitioners than there are men, but it's slowly growing. And with my own group, I'm always happy to go and get really impressed in every time. And I joke that I get beaten up by all of these 60, 70, 80-year-old Japanese grandmothers, that they are some of the simultaneously most kind and caring, but also strict people that I know. And it's fun learning something new. Outside of martial arts, though, I also studied the Japanese bamboo flute, the shakuhachi, which is the flute that is it's a vertical flute instead of the festival flute that's more of a the sidewise. And I started doing that again in Ishikawa, and then continued with proper instruction through my time in Aomori. And then once again, after moving to Ibaraki, more or less stopped my formal study and just kind of play it as an instrument that sometimes I'll try to get better, but mostly it's playing the same songs that I know over and over and over. But, you know, it's a comfortable, familiar instrument. And then outside of that is just a smattering of other Japanese pursuits, from the kendama ball and stick toy that is just a traditional Japanese dexterity toy, to learning little bits of Japanese card games and variations, and small bits of origami.
Okay.
Just a variety of different things here and there.
What about reenactment of ancient battles?
Ah, yes. that was a fun one that I've done on 3 separate occasions. The city of Fuefuki in Yamanashi has a reenactment battle of the Battle of Kawanakajima, which, as a quick aside, is interesting because Kawanakajima is located several hundred kilometers away from Fuefuki City, in Nagano, where, surprise, was right down the street from where I was living.
Wow.
So the battle itself, I knew well, and was initially confused when I heard that they were doing a reenactment so far away. But as it turns out, I forget which one, but it was that area was the home province to one of the leaders, the generals that were in the actual battle. But one year at the English school, I had seen a advertisement saying, we're open, we're looking for more applicants to be reenactors of the battle, and spoke with a number of the other foreign members, and we filled out our forms. And on the day that applications opened, I made sure to be one of the first people sending in a fax, and we made the cut.
Wow.
So we had our foreign group of participants in the reenactment battle, and it was popular enough with the staff that we actually did it on 2 more occasions later. And it's again, one of those things that really you can only do in Japan. In America, they do Civil War reenactments, and I know that in Europe there are a number of groups that do reenactments of historical fighting units and battles. But this was a very, very unique one to go through, and the pictures are always fun to share.
How do you balance work and family these days?
It's much easier now. When I was a manager at the school, of course, managing takes, as I mentioned, a lot of time. So sometimes, it'd be like, wouldn't go home until 10:30 or 11 at night, which makes it hard to have a family life, especially when your spouse, in this case, my wife, has a regular 9-to-5 job. So would be out the door at 7:30 in the morning, which would leave very little waking hours that both of us would be up together. Now it's much better. I'm self-employed, primarily teaching English, doing little bits of translation and English editing, which is great because now I've made my own schedule, which is a much more normal working schedule. And with that, we have some time in the morning together as a family, and then all head out to our respective workplaces and schools. And then at the end of the day, usually now I'm back home by 7 p.m. And with that, the whole family is back by 7 or 7:30, and happily have a couple hours that we can spend together. And even if we aren't actively engaged with each other in activities, we're in the same room. We're doing our own things in that area. And, if we have questions or comments to things to share with each other, we can easily do. And that's one of the things that the American side of me thinks is very, very important, is that spending of time together, even if you aren't doing the same things together, being together is
Right.
important. One story that I've mentioned lots to Japanese people as one of the cultural differences was that in America, if a businessman had maybe 3 more hours of work that had to be done before 8 a.m. the next day, and it's 5:30 p.m. in the end of his designated working hours, the American businessman would pack up his briefcase, go home, and then, have dinner with the family, maybe, chat, play with the kids, do whatever. And then after they were settled down for the night, would open up that briefcase and then spend the 3 hours, maybe working from 9 to midnight to finish everything up. But the next morning at 8 a.m., all the work is done.
Right.
The Japanese businessman would, same thing, finish at 5:30 and look and say, I've got 3 more hours of work. So would sit there and power through the work 6:30, 7:30, 8:30, maybe finally get through and it be 9 o'clock, go home. So gets home, let's say 9 to 9:30. But by this point, gets home, his dinner's cold. So sits, eats dinner, and by the time he's finished dinner, it's already 10 or 10:30. The children, I'm assuming the same ages, would already be in bed. Probably wife is already in bed or ready for bed and such. So then, spends the time alone, goes to bed, and then the next day at 8 in the morning, work is finished. And I think that was a huge, and still is in many cases, a difference between the idea of work and work ethics. That in America, the work, yes, is important, but your family is more important. And if the work is done the next day, then why would you ever choose to not go and spend the time with your family? Whereas the Japanese idea is, no, the work has to be done first, with the thinking that if I lose my job, I am working for my family. Work is how I support my family. Therefore, the work must come first, which, of course, speaking from my American point of view, is not the correct choice between those two. Every situation is different. In some times, I'm sure it would be, but that bit of being with family is something that I think is very, very important, and important with family work-life balance.
So do you speak Japanese at home?
Primarily, yes. I, in raising my son, I think I should be speaking more English, but and when we have extra time, I will speak and do speak more English. But I had to make a decision early on whether, when he had his day at the preschool, and I would pick him up and say, "Oh, how was your day today?" With his entire day being in Japanese at the Japanese preschool. So I had to make a choice. Was I going to have him respond in English and correct everything he said in English at the expense of possibly not hearing about his day just
Right.
because he couldn't say what he wanted and therefore would choose not to say whatever, or listen to him in Japanese, and things that I could easily change to English, focus on those for little bits of English. And ultimately, I decided to go with the listening and speaking more Japanese than with English. However, one of the people that I first met when I moved to Japan for work was raising her son in Japan.
Okay.
And she had much stronger willpower than I did, because even though she was superbly fluent in Japanese, she would only speak English to her son. And whenever he spoke to her, he had to use English. The only time he could use Japanese was when asking her what a specific Japanese word was in English. And it was amazing because I watched her at her house when her son had friends over, and she would be speaking with them and just joking in Japanese the entire time. But anything that was addressed to her son could change on a dime and just drop right back into English, continue that, and pick up. And of course, her son was amazingly bilingual as a result. One of the things that I do with my son, though, in order to try to have his English abilities be higher, are we'll often, when we're in the car together, I will ask him to choose 3 to 5 words that he doesn't know in English, and just ask me, how do I say these things? And then I will teach those. But over the next few days, I will use those words as many ways as possible in English talking and conversation, and sometimes quiz him on those. And this, of course, ties in with the theory that things that you want to know are easy to remember. Things that the textbook or the teacher decides that you need to know are usually harder to remember. So that's one way of trying to help improve his vocabulary. And then the other one is, unfortunately, because of the pandemic, we haven't been able to do, but that is spend time abroad with relatives in America. And being able to do that again soon is one of my high hopes, is being in a English speaking country for a while tends to jump fluency levels just because all those little things start clicking together. And I'm very jealous of all of the Japanese students who are able to start studying foreign languages when they're in preschool and elementary school, because the first foreign language I got to study was when I was a junior high school student. And I wish that I had studied for 6 years before then, and then I would have had much more fluency and probably much fewer learning woes, because I would have been learning it simultaneously with my first language as opposed to analytically looking at it later.
Okay, what advice would you give to someone who is thinking about either coming to work in Japan or to live?
This would be to any country for the first piece of advice, which is, don't look at everything through rose-colored glasses. We all, if it's a choice that somebody makes to teach, live, work in a foreign country, there's something that appeals to them. It could be the culture, it could be the language itself, it might be the history. It might be a particular person
Mm,
that you're like, nope, I'm going to go to France because this person lives in France. And that's perfectly fine. But um, if you're living in another country, you have to understand that some of the social norms will be different. And for some of those, it's more the job of the person going to that country
mm,
to assimilate.
mm,
But by no means should you be expected to do so and go completely native
mm,
and do everything the way that that country does. To do so, I think, is a disservice to the world as a whole because we have this plethora of wonderful cultures that are different everywhere.
mm, mm,
And they all have good things and they all have arguably bad things.
mm,
But the difference is what makes the world such this rich tapestry of ideas and interactions, and how that a musician in one country can have a little bit of a song that a musician in another country hears and then uses that in their own
mm,
music
mm,
in new and interesting ways. That being able to share those differences and ideas is an important thing. Um, the other one is, don't expect that going to a different country will
mm.
completely make a new you. Um, yes, it's especially, I would say, for college students
Mhm,
or people who are living far away from their families for the first time. It may not make a new you,
mhm,
but it can be a good experience and good chance to explore other aspects of your personality without the expectations of people who've known you all your life to
mm,
do things a certain way. It's the same way that people who tend to go to their local college town that's not far from their hometown
mm, mm,
are the ones that people tend to say, oh, you're just like I remember. You haven't changed at all.
mm.
But the people who go to colleges far away from their homes are often the ones that other people, oh man, you've changed. You're so different. I hardly recognized you.
Mm,
And I think that's because growing up, family and other people do have expectations. When you go to another country, you can be
right.
free of lots of those.
Right.
But and that would be advice for people going to, I think, any country.
Right.
The other one for people going to any country would be, when you go, choose one or two things that are unique to that country.
Mm,
One or two things that are maybe only found in that area, or a version of something
mm,
that is uniquely that country.
mm,
Um, Food is an easy one to recommend. Learn to cook some of those traditional cuisines,
mm,
but choose a traditional craft or something that you can ultimately learn and then
mm,
take back with you, because it is able to actually have reverse homesickness
mm, mm,
after you've returned to your home country after living abroad. And there's certain things that you can't take back all of the people, you can't take back all of the memories, but you can learn something
mm,
to take back and share.
mm, mm,
And those are things that I highly recommend people choose something
mm,
to try to learn. And it doesn't have to be, something super rare and unique.
mm.
If you come to Japan and learn karate, lots of
Right.
people would say, you can learn karate anywhere. You're like, well, yes, but I learned it in Japan. And
Right.
I got to experience going to the Japanese dojo and learning the Japanese style
Mm,
of
mm,
all of these things. And that's something that you can have and carry with you. But if you only live in a country as an observer,
mm,
and like the anthropologist who just sits
mm.
back with binoculars and watches everything and makes notes, then it's more like you're simply living in your home country
Mm, mm,
as an observer.
mm, mm,
And that that ties into the last piece of advice, I think,
mm,
for people moving to any country is don't limit yourself to the expat community.
mm,
Yes, these are the people who will understand your situation better because they're in a similar situation, but you'll get tied into your own ways of thinking that are unique to you. And it's a echo chamber of
mm,
sorts that really, to understand the country that you've chosen to go to,
mm,
you need to try to make friends and acquaintances in that country and learn from them. Advice for Japan specifically
mhm.
is really try to learn the language. Um, there are many people
Mm,
who I've known over the years who've lived in Japan an extremely long time,
right.
some that have been here for upwards of 50 years. And due to the fact that you can use English in
Mm,
most places, and especially now with Google Translate and all of the translation apps,
mm,
you don't have to understand
mm,
Japanese.
right.
You can get by with your daily life in almost every situation. But there's so many things that you miss by doing so. It's, you know, it would be going through America that has all of the historic marker signs in every town, village saying that this is where this famous thing happened. This is where this event happened. This commemorates this.
Mm,
But if you can't read Japanese,
right.
then all of this history that's at your fingertips and around you, you just walk past every
Mm,
day.
mm, mm,
Um, it's learn to get those new eyes to let you see things. The other one is for Japan,
mhm,
understand that the Japanese idea of friendship and the Western idea of friendship,
mm,
I can't speak for every country,
mhm.
but for those that I'm familiar with, are very different.
Okay.
That in Japan, um, you can know somebody for maybe years
Mm,
before you might actually call them a friend
mm,
instead of a coworker
mm,
or an acquaintance. Um, Lots are the lifelong friends that people have because they grew up together.
mhm,
But um, there are many people that I would consider, and from my perspective, would
mhm.
say are friends,
Right.
but and I would gladly invite them over to the house
Mhm,
or to go out and do some other activities.
mm,
But on the Japanese side, it is extremely rare to be
mm,
invited to somebody's house
right.
ever.
Mm, mm,
Um, and it's important to be aware that of that cultural difference,
mhm,
that it's not a slight. It's not that they don't like you.
mm,
It's just a very different take on friendship.
mm, mm,
And there are, of course, many, many exceptions. The um, younger generations now
right.
are much more open in
Okay.
many cases to meeting new people and saying, hey, let's go out wherever.
Right.
But in Japan, if you just want to meet other people,
Mm,
it's really hard to do so.
Mm,
It's more you'll meet people through some activity that you're
right.
involved in, and slowly that will expand your social circle,
Mm, mm,
where somebody else may say, oh well, you should meet so and so, or
mm, mm,
let's do this thing. But it takes a lot more effort,
mm, mm,
and that those differences can be a surprising
mm, mm.
one.
Okay, if someone is looking for a teacher with your level of experience,
Mhm.
how do they get in touch with you? That is, if
Um,
you have room on in your schedule.
right. Um, right now,
Mhm.
what's fun is I work completely through word of mouth.
Okay.
Um, all of my personal private students
Mm,
have been introduced by either other students
mhm,
or through a few other people that I know
mm,
who are foreign teachers. And when people say, "Oh, could you teach, or do you know somebody who's available to teach?"
mm,
and will
mm.
often introduce me.
Right.
The other one is I teach at a number of preschools, kindergartens, some factories, and the like. And occasionally I will see openings, and I
Okay.
will contact schools and ask if they would be interested in my particular style of instruction and what I
Okay.
have to offer. But mostly it is word of mouth. And with my current workload,
Mm,
I'm happy to leave it there,
okay.
because it makes it much easier to not have to decline
Mm, mm.
people by simply perhaps saying, having a web page that says I'm
Right.
available, and then somebody just seeing that
Mm,
and contacting and, well, I can't do this times or
mm,
this
mm,
times.
mm,
But if it's more via an introduction, there's more room to discuss and negotiate
mm,
potential
mm.
times.
Okay,
But
my final question.
yes,
Were you born with your mellifluous radio voice, or did you train for it?
um, I wasn't born with it, but I, growing up, my father was in the US Navy.
Okay.
And during my formative language years,
Mm,
we moved up and down the Atlantic seaboard.
mm,
So I was born in Alabama,
mhm,
but before I was in second grade elementary school,
mm.
I believe I lived in 7 different places.
Okay.
So I lived in Alabama, um, 2 different places in Georgia,
Mm,
um, Virginia, South Carolina,
mm.
Virginia a second time, and Rhode Island.
Wow.
And I believe that my own voice is actually just an amalgam
Right.
of all of these different accents.
Mm,
Um, Many people who've tried to guess where I'm from
mm.
just with my voice have said Minnesota or Montana. And I don't know what a Montanan or a Minnesotan accent sounds like,
Right.
but I assume, since multiple people have told me this,
Mm,
that
mm,
it's
mm,
similar. But um, I do have a natural Southern drawl
mhm.
from the long time that I've lived in the South.
Right.
And if I change into that, it actually takes me 2 or 3 minutes to work it back out of my voice.
Right, right, right.
But yeah, I enjoy talking, so I'm glad to hear that my voice is perhaps easy to listen to.
Right, right, right. Well, you've been very generous with your time. Is there
Um,
anything else that I didn't ask you that you really want to get off your chest?
um, Maybe nothing to get off my chest, but for everybody studying language
Mm.
in different places, whether it's English or other foreign languages, it came out in this interview, but by all means, make mistakes. Don't intentionally make mistakes.
Right.
But if you make a mistake, you will tend to remember and learn
Mm.
from that mistake. There is a saying in Japanese that says, like, it's embarrassing or it's a shame
Mm.
to ask something,
Mm.
but it's only a short shame.
Okay.
But not asking is a shame for a lifetime.
Mm. Mm. That's
It's
powerful.
it's saying that just that moment of asking, yes, it's embarrassing.
Mm. Mm.
It's admitting that you don't know something.
Mm.
But by admitting it, then you
Mm.
can learn it, as opposed to a lifetime of simply not knowing.
Mm. Mm.
And that, I think, is one of the most important things that any learner of anything
Mm. Mm.
can keep in mind and do, is that idea that if you know what you need to learn, you can
Mm.
fix it.
Mm. Mm.
And by asking at that point is the fastest way to learn.
That's memorable. Thank you so very much.
No problem. It was my pleasure.
We'll be in touch.
Sounds good. Thank you
Thank
again.
you. Bye-bye.